The best part of meditative practice is that moment when you release attachment to thought and you start to hover in this sort of unknowability. It's the opposite of therapy in that way. In therapy, you dig, you interpret, you resolve. In meditation, you just rest in the hover. And once the practice ends, you emerge with a knowing that is indescribable but very felt still. When's the last time art made you feel that way? What got me thinking about all of this is Oscar Wilde's essay, The Decay of Lying. In it, he makes two arguments. Number one, that life imitates art as opposed to art imitating life. And number two, that truth degrades art. His first point, that life imitates art, has been pretty well established in art discourse since then. The example Wilde himself uses to illustrate this is fog. He says, at present, people see fogs not because they are fogs, but because poets and painters have taught them the mysterious loveliness of such effects. In other words, fog was just condensation before an artist or poet used it to depict obscurity and turned it into atmosphere for the rest of us. Wilde does go on to say that fog is overdone as an effect and claims that it gives dull people bronchitis, but his point still stands. And of course, there's also submarines, which were first conceived by Jules Verne in 20,000 Leagues, space travel, first imagined in A Trip to the Moon in 2001: A Space Odyssey, and even mountains needed romantics to turn them into something sublime instead of just big, barren rock that served as natural political borders. And of course, our own beauty standards and what we aspire to look like is determined by the broad image-making apparatus, some of which, the fashion for example, is art. His second argument, that truth degrades art, stood out to me more. Wilde believes that the preoccupation of his time with depicting reality in art leads art to represent the commonplace and simple truths as opposed to complex beauty and indescribable wisdom, as he believes art should. He denounced authors like Émile Zola, who write as if they're journalists, and painters like Gustave Courbet, who depict images that aim to replicate life and nature. Susan Sontag's 1966 Against Interpretation believes the same is true in her time. She says, most American novelists and playwrights are really either journalists or gentlemen sociologists and psychologists. They are writing the literary equivalent of program music. My previous essay, which I'll link down below, does give context into programmed music. Wilde thinks that at the very least, art should exaggerate nature so as to give nature something to aspire to. But ideally for him, art would be a lie. Enough of a lie that it is able to reveal a deeper truth. Enough of a lie that it doesn't explicitly represent something obvious, but instead leaves the viewer or the reader in that place of being suspended in the hover that yields true meaning. Realistic art, according to Wilde, even fails at what it seeks out to do, which is to accurately represent its time. The more abstract, Wilde says, the more ideal art is, the more it reveals to us the temper of its age. And I agree. There's not a lot that realistic art tells me about the spirit of a society other than its taste for realism. If we wish to understand a nation by means of its art, he continues, let us look at its architecture or its music. Architecture and music more easily escape the trap of realism because their forms are innately less discursive than the visual arts and literature. If a painter or a sculptor depicts a horse, our brains automatically read it as a horse and try to compare it to the real thing, meaning that the first interaction we have with a piece of art is inevitably, is this a good horse? And we get distracted by and wrapped up in the whole fidelity aspect of it. As Wilde says, man can believe the impossible, but man can never believe the improbable. In literature, it's even more unavoidable because the medium of literature is language, the most discursive form of all. But architecture doesn't depict, it just is. And because it is shelter and industry as much as it is art, and because we interact with it by transversing it en route to other things, resting, socializing, working, we don't try to reduce or interpret architecture in the same way as other art mediums. Music, then, because it's perceived through hearing, similarly has no true point of reference. This is interesting in itself because it highlights our understanding of hearing as a secondary sense. Somewhere in Western epistemology, we decided that sight is the sense that verifies reality. Seeing is believing. So music, because it cannot be visualized, carries no burden of proof and is therefore more likely to lie, per Wilde's definition. In Philosophy in a New Key, Suzanne Langer agrees about the strength of music. She argues that all genuine art has significant form, a term coined by English art critic Clive Bell. Significant form is that nebulous quality of art that provokes universality and aesthetic emotion over direct representation. Langer believes that if the meaning of art belongs to the sensuous percept itself, apart from what it ostensibly represents, then such purely artistic meaning should be most accessible through musical works. But music wasn't always viewed this way. In the classical period, some considered music to be the most lowly form of art. For one, because it left no object. Once a piece of music was performed, it vanished. It did not leave its mark on the world as did a painting or a building or a scroll. Plato in particular judged music because he found its emotional impact to be politically dubious. The Greeks perceived music, along with poetry and dance, to be more aligned with the spirit and to influence the soul before reason and logic. As such, they believed that exposure to the wrong kind of music would lead a person to become weak and immoral. Specifically, Plato argued that the Dorian and Phrygian modes promoted strength, logic, and self-control, while the Lydian and Ionian modes were emotionally indulgent and led to moral decay. Briefly, for anyone who's unfamiliar with musical modes, the Ionian mode is the straight-up C major mode, the do-re-mis as we learn them in the West. Let It Be by the Beatles and Fake Plastic Trees by Radiohead are in the Ionian mode. The Lydian mode is virtually the same as the Ionian mode with a sharp fourth, which adds a bit more of an ethereal sound quality. Dreams by Fleetwood Mac and Reckoner by Radiohead are in this mode. These two modes, these mostly major modes, are the ones Plato perceived as emotionally indulgent and morally unsound. Essentially, R.I.P. Plato, you would have hated pop music. Then we have the Dorian mode, which has a flat third and a flat seventh. This makes the scale more minor and mysterious. Riders on the Storm by the Doors and 15 Steps by Radiohead are in this mode. And lastly, the Phrygian has a flat second, flat third, flat sixth, and flat seventh, or inversely, it is the natural minor with a lowered second. This gives the mode more of an unnerving and Eastern sound. Missy Elliott's Get Your Freak On and Pyramid Song by Radiohead use this mode. Classical Greek philosophers were skeptics, and they believed that the world as we know it is a poor source of truth on account of its ever-changing nature. Living things are born, decay, and die, the seasons change, and even in the exact present moment where things are relatively stagnant, our senses are liable to deceive us and interpret something not as it truly is. The Heraclitus claim that no man ever steps in the same river twice, for it's not the same river and he's not the same man, stems from these tenets. But Plato believed that this isn't the full story, and that beneath all the uncertainty and elusiveness of truth, there is an underlying reality and permanence that is found in the world of forms and ideals. Plato's forms are abstract ideals that embody the essential qualities of concepts. Let's take, for instance, the perfect triangle. Although as humans we cannot observe nor recreate a perfect triangle, we can conceive of it and recognize it as a reality in its abstract state. Plato argues that this act of conception alone can bring us closer to truth, as close as we can get to truth at least. And forms were not just mathematical. They applied to nature, structures, men and women, and even morals like goodness, kindness. According to Plato, true and reliable knowledge rests only with those who can comprehend the true reality behind the world of everyday experience, and that this knowledge is derived from studying forms. Now, when it comes to representing the ideal in art, Plato argued that any attempt to recreate a form will end up being a pale facsimile of the perfect idea, just as everything in this world is an imperfect representation of its perfect form. This means that the more we reproduce, the further we get from truth. A bed is usually given as the example here. We can conceive of the perfect bed, the ideal form of bed, and that connection is the closest we can get to the true thing. A carpenter who builds a bed processes the ideal through natural material in human hands, distancing that result from the ideal form by 1 degree. If a painter were to then paint that bed, he would be creating a copy of a copy, 2 degrees from truth. The same goes for a painting of a tree, say, or even a person. Trees and humans as they exist in the world are already a degree apart from their ideal forms. A realistic depiction of either as painting or sculpture adds yet another degree of separation. Art that reaches to portray the conceived ideal, then, rather than copying the natural instance, is only 1 degree from truth, which is preferable. This is why Greek art concerned itself with depicting the gods rather than Deices and Demetres from down the block. In Plato's view, the attempt to represent the ideal wasn't futile. Even a facsimile of form could trigger anamnesis, the soul's recollection of what it knew before incarnation. While the sculpture depicting the ideal form doesn't show you the form, it does remind you that it exists. And that was considered the highest thing art could offer. This means that Plato and Wilde were broadly in agreement. Both valued art for its ability to tell the beautiful lie. Of course, to Plato, the lie was an inevitable concession, whereas to Wilde, it was very much the point. Over the 2200 odd years between Plato and Wilde, through the Renaissance, the Reformation, the Enlightenment, and the Industrial Age, fact and evidence had become the ultimate virtues, not only in science, but also in art and in religion. The Reformation is an especially interesting case study because of how forcefully it rejected symbolism and, in turn, the lie from religious art and literature. The Reformation was in large part a response to the corruption of the Catholic Church by way of its economy of salvation. Prior to the Reformation, Catholic Church officials would sell indulgences, meaning that people could essentially pay to reduce their time in purgatory. Often this exchange centered around religious relics. Contact with the relic was believed to confer the indulgence, and church officials charged for the privilege of touching or coming into contact with one. Reformation thinkers criticized these practices and argued that symbolism and allegory, anything that was ambiguous in meaning, relied on religious authority for interpretation, giving the church undue power and breeding corruption. In turn, they rejected holy relics and icons and pushed for sola scriptura, the Protestant doctrine that scripture is the only infallible authority for faith. This led to a much more literal interpretation of the Bible and mirrored a broader tendency of the time to seek truth and reject interpretation, even in secular literature. Much of the art in Wilde's period ended up very far removed from both the ideal form and the significant form, though of course the Victorian insistence on documenting the veritable meant documenting observable reality, with the observable ultimately representing what was apparent on the surface. In other words, what was documented in art and literature, etc., was what English civic virtue deemed legitimate. As a gay man, Wilde understood how suppressing the beautiful lie in art also demanded the suppression of an authentic interior life. What I think illustrates this really well is the English reception of Nana by Émile Zola. Yes, the same Émile Zola who Wilde critiqued for being too journalistic. Nana, a novel about a French courtesan, was widely celebrated in France for its naturalism and its symbolization of moral decay. But it outraged English Victorians who called it immoral and even pornographic. So again, the taste for realism was selective, but it's still presented as absolute and as aspirational in both political and social life. And those virtues did serve as the template against which people measured their own existence. One might even say that being earnest was a farce until it wasn't. The ancient Greeks' contrasting perception of the ideal form and natural form also shaped the value they assigned to the people who dealt in either. Those who worked in the realms of Plato's forms and ideas were the artists, craftsmen, and statesmen. The others dealt in the maintenance of life, or in what I'll refer to as metabolic labor, food cultivation and preparation, sanitation, etc. The artists and craftsmen, as we said, are those who produce the most representative depiction of the ideal form. In doing so, they bring the rest of the citizenry closer to truth, and importantly, their creations have permanence and can elude the decay of natural things. And it is through permanence that societies are built, the art, the objects, the architecture, the ideas that remain and that are adopted by future generations, even after their original maker dies. The art, the objects, and the architecture were, of course, the domain of the craftsman, while the ideas were the domain of the statesman. For the Greek citizen, participation in politics and public life was the definition of full humanity. It signified freedom, influence, and proximity to philosophical thought. But in a time before industrialization and centralization, where everything had to be done by hand, being available for public life meant that you were free from metabolic necessity. Of course, that is not to say that ancient Greek statesmen did not eat or excrete, but that the labor of natural life, the planting, weeding, harvesting, preparing, cleaning, which was all consuming, was delegated to the lower class and to the enslaved class. In The Human Condition, Hannah Arendt describes it like this: the burden of biological life, weighing down and consuming the specifically human lifespan between birth and death, can be eliminated only by the use of servants, and the chief function of ancient slaves was rather to carry the burden of consumption in the household than to produce for society at large. Metabolic labor was done in service of the body, and the Greeks considered the body to be an obstacle to the life of the mind. The body belonged to the domain of nature, and nature was, one, poor facsimile of truth, and two, prone to decay, and so it did not further culture or society. The labor that served it was necessary for sustenance, sure, but it was cyclical and its products disappeared as soon as they were created. The food eaten, the floor dirtied. And more philosophically, metabolic necessity was a nagging reminder of one's mortality and eventual demise. This did make me wonder if devaluing this kind of metabolic labor preceded slavery in Greek society, or if enslavement was a pre-existing condition that allowed metabolic labor to be delegated. Hannah Arendt argues the former. She says, the institution of slavery in antiquity, though not in later times, was not a device for cheap labor or an instrument of exploitation for profit, but rather the attempt to exclude labor from the conditions of man's life. I'm not sure if it matters whether philosophy preceded politics as much as it matters that one ended up reinforcing the other, the enslavement of people supported and justified by this philosophical need to erase metabolic labor from the human condition. I think it's fair to say, too, that we have eradicated the politics that permitted slavery to a much greater extent than we have eradicated the philosophy of devaluing metabolic labor, or what we still sometimes call unskilled labor. And this lingering philosophy enables dominant power structures to justify undervaluing and underpaying a large section of the working class. But it's also interesting to consider Arendt's central argument in The Human Condition, which is that we have progressively elevated the status of labor and trapped more and more of the work that we do in this cyclical metabolic trap. She argues that this elevation of labor happened across three thinkers. First, John Locke, who argued that labor legitimizes property rights. You can combine your labor with some land, and you can now own the land. Second, Adam Smith, who viewed labor as the fundamental source of all economic wealth. And last, Karl Marx, who argued that labor is the source of all value. Of course, in Marx's view, capitalism exploits the laborer in that it forces him to sell his labor power to whoever owns the means of production. and in doing so, forces the laborer to surrender the product, the profit, and his own value to another. But the Reformation, which predated Locke by about 100 years, was actually a big one here too. Martin Luther, for one, introduced the concept of vocation. He argued that all work, not just the work of church officials, has inherent dignity, which of course elevated the status and perception of labor. And in Calvinism, economic success was seen as evidence of salvation. Calvinism was built around the doctrine of predestination, which means that salvation is determined at birth rather than earned. This left followers to search for signs of election and saw economic prosperity as evidence of having been chosen by God. As well, Calvinists believed that everyone has a God-given vocation or calling, and that fulfilling one's calling was a means of serving God. So in this tradition, labor was elevated to a moral imperative and considered to be evidence of God's grace. The Industrial Revolution then mechanized the means of production and stripped them from the craftsman. It reduced production to its most fungible elements and distributed those elements across the labor force. The shoemaker was replaced by a height selector, a leather cutter, an eyelet puncher, etc. Modern-day automation has abstracted us even further by removing craftsmanship out of human hands entirely. And even intellectual work, Arendt argues, despite being respected and well compensated, does not automatically save us from metabolic labor if it doesn't add something durable to the world. She says, insofar as the intellectual is indeed not a worker who, like all other workers, from the humblest of craftsmen to the greatest artist, is engaged in adding one more, if possible, durable thing to the human artifice, he resembles perhaps nobody so much as Adam Smith's menial servant. Although his function is less to keep the life process intact and provide for its regeneration than to care for the upkeep of various gigantic bureaucratic machines whose processes consume their services and devour their products as quickly and mercilessly as the biological life process itself. Our entire economic system largely operates in these same cyclical in and out terms. And now everything is about consuming. We consume food, media, art. Products are termed consumer goods, which is especially salient when you consider something like fast fashion. Everything is metabolic. But I'm not trying to make value judgments about Western economic systems. What I do find interesting is how we have progressively filled our work with abstraction, all the while stripping our art from it. And our contemporary art doesn't lack abstraction because our society is overly concerned with being truthful and verifiable. I mean, let's be real. And I'm not saying that great, meaningful, abstract art isn't being made either. But despite that, and despite the freedom of artistic expression we currently have in the West, we are in two traps that prevent our art from telling the beautiful lie. The first trap is our tendency toward interpretation. In Against Interpretation, Susan Sontag argues that all Western consciousness of and reflection upon art have remained within the confines staked out by the Greek theory of art as mimesis or representation. It is through this theory that art as such becomes problematic, in need of defense, and it is the defense of art which gives birth to the odd vision by which something we have learned to call form is separated from something we have learned to call content, and to the well-intentioned move which makes content essential and form accessory. Here, content refers to explicit meaning, what the piece of art is trying to say. In other words, we don't believe that art for art's sake is enough, and we expect it to justify itself by having a specific message that it's trying to impart. But we know that as soon as we attempt to reduce art to specific content, we rip it away from its significant form. Sontag continues, ours is a culture based on excess, on overproduction. The result is a steady loss of sharpness in our sensory experience. All the conditions of modern life, its material plentitude, its sheer crowdedness, conjoin to dull our sensory faculties. And it is in the light of the condition of our senses, our capacities, rather than those of another age, that the task of the critic must be assessed. She writes this in the 1960s, but it's even more true now. And what's worse is that our most prolific critic, a figure historically responsible for discovering new work, contextualizing it, and arguing for its value, is now the algorithm. And this algorithmic critic isn't motivated by a love of art or a love of discovery and a desire to introduce others to something significant. It isn't even motivated by vanity, the wish to seem cultured or contrarian or clever. Its only stake is increasing consumption. As Ed Finn says in his essay, How Algorithms Are Transforming Artistic Creativity, we rely on computational systems for our essential aesthetic vocabulary, learning what is good and beautiful through a prism of 5-star rating systems and social media endorsements. Which leads us to our second trap, the platforms. We see hundreds of images daily, parsing through them at insane speeds, barely pausing to consider them. The real irony is that Sontag's content, that reductive, extractive approach to art she was criticizing, looks almost quaint next to the content label we've applied to art today. Our attentional capacity is so jacked up that we don't often even spend time to extract from the art we see on socials. And artists, if they want to be competitive, must consider trends, stick to a consistent brand, become experts at marketing. Rather than having the liberty to create out of inspiration or an inner image, they're made to perpetuate the metabolic feedback loop of the platform's algorithm. Hannah Arendt says this about art. Works of art are the most intensely worldly of all tangible things. Their durability is almost untouched by the corroding effect of natural processes, since they are not subject to the use of living creatures, a use which indeed, far from actualizing their own inherent purpose, can only destroy them. We have made art useful, and not even for us, but for the platforms. And we use this creativity for the sake of drawing in attention, but not the type of attention that art deserves. I don't want to make value judgments about social media either. I'm saying all of this through one, after all. But I do agree with Sontag's call to action, the non-marketing kind. What is important now, she urges, is to recover our senses. We must learn to see more, to hear more, to feel more. She closes against interpretation with this perfect line. In place of hermeneutics, we need erotics of art. We need erotics of art in place of algorithmic interpretation as well. Thank you for sitting with me, and until next time.